to the picture. Okay, so in number 1, you have a certain given information and you have what you're trying to prove. So that's what you have to get down to in your statements. Okay, so our given information says that segment LA is parallel to segment SN. That's what that symbol means. It means parallel. So I want to write that on my picture here. So for parallel, we label that with arrows. Okay, so LA is parallel to SN. Okay, so those two segments are parallel. Now I'm also given that segment LR is congruent to segment NR. Okay, so LR and NR. We mark those as congruent. So you want to mark up this picture. Now I'm trying to prove that triangle LAR, so this triangle here, is congruent to triangle NSR, so this triangle over here. So to prove two triangles congruent, you either need to use side, 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 side angle, side, stuff like that. So you have to look for congruent angles and congruent sides between the two triangles. Okay, so whenever you are given parallel lines, that's an indication that you should look for congruent angles. Okay, you should look for congruent angles when you have parallel lines. So looking over at our proof here, we always start with our given information. Okay, so we have segment LA parallel to segment SN. Okay, the reason behind writing that is because it was given to us. That's our given information. Now I want to use that given information to find congruent angles. So if I know that this line or segment here is parallel to this line or segment here, okay, I want to look for a transversal, so another line that cuts through both of those. Okay, well, line LN intersects both of those parallel lines, right? Yeah? So in my next statement, it does say angle L is congruent to angle N. Okay, so it's saying these two angles are congruent. What type of angles are those if those lines are parallel? Do you remember what type of angles they are? Are they corresponding? Are they alternate exterior? Alternate interior? They are alternate interior angles, right? Okay, so these two angles are alternate interior angles. So if you have your packet from yesterday, okay, you have your packet from yesterday, take it out. The last thing we talked about in that packet was about parallel lines and the angles created. Okay, so on the very back, one of them you are given parallel lines, the other one you are given congruent angles. In this case, am I given that those angles were congruent, or was I given that those lines were parallel? I was given they're parallel. So you need to look at the definition or property, okay, that says if parallel. Okay, so the ones that say if parallel on the back. So I can say that these two angles are congruent because if those lines are parallel, then again, what type of angles are these? Alternate interior angles are congruent. So whenever you're given parallel lines, you're using this if parallel statement. Okay, and then you have to identify what type of angle pair those are. Okay? From here, I can continue moving through my proof. Now, I only used one part of my given here. Okay, I used that first part, so that I could come up with these angles that are congruent. Okay, I still have to use this second part within my proof. Okay, it doesn't just go away. You have to use it within your proof. Okay, well that's what's written right here, right? And it's already labeled in my picture. So I can write this in my proof because it was given to me. So again, I have given information. So the next part here, okay, I can't really use that those two segments are congruent, right? I just had to label in my picture. Next, what I want to do is look to see if I have any freebies in my picture. So are there any sides that I could label congruent or angles that I could label congruent just by looking at the picture? Well, I know that I have vertical angles. Okay, so I have these two lines, LN and AS, okay, that intersect, right? When two lines intersect, their vertical angles are congruent. Okay, so whenever you see those vertical angles within your picture, I would label them congruent. Now, which property says why I can label those vertical angles congruent in your packet? Close. Which one talks about vertical angles? The vertical angle theorem. So I can say that angle LRA, that's one I labeled, and angle NRS, okay, those are congruent because of the vertical angle theorem. Okay, so those are congruent by the vertical angle theorem. Now the last one here should always be, this statement should always be what I'm trying to prove. Okay, so triangle LAR is congruent to triangle NSR. Okay, so this is what we talked about on Monday. Okay, so looking at those labels, do I use side, side, side? Do I use angle, angle, side? Okay, and so forth. So when I look at my labels here, I have two angles, right, within a triangle and one side. Now that side is between your two angles that are labeled. So that means these triangles are congruent by angle, side, angle. Questions? Yeah.
Okay.
Most of your, well, all of your properties are in that property packet except for the triangle ones, which is side, 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 side angle, side, stuff like that. Those ones aren't in there.
Okay.
Other questions? We're going to do another one. All right, so with this one here, again, first thing I do is look at my given information.
Yep.
So I'm given O as the midpoint of MQ. Okay, well, if O is this midpoint of that line segment, what do you know about the pieces there? They're equal. I'm going to label it right away. Okay, I'm using what I was given to label my picture. Okay, I also have O as the midpoint of NP. So again, this is the midpoint. So what do I know about those? They're equal. So we're going to label that. Okay, we want to prove that triangle MON, so that is this triangle right here, okay, the one I shaded, that's that triangle, is congruent to triangle QOP. So that's this one right here. Okay, so you do have to identify which two triangles they're trying to have you prove. So from here, since I've labeled my picture, again, you always want to start with one of the parts of your given. Okay, so I'm going to start with O as the midpoint of MQ. And again, I write that out because it was given to you. Now I want to use that information to come up with my next statement. Well, in my picture, you told me that these two pieces were equal, right? So because I labeled that in the picture, I need to write that out as a statement. Okay, so I can write out that MO, that segment, is congruent to OQ. Now I was using that given information that I had a midpoint, right? So why can I write out that statement if I'm using a midpoint? Which one of my properties is that? It is midpoint theorem. Okay, so you are using midpoint theorem for that one. Okay, so now that I used one part of my given and I found another statement to go with it, I want to take the second part of my given and I want to write it as a statement as well. So whatever you're given always has to be in your proof. Okay, so I'm going to write out O. Okay, I'm going to abbreviate midpoint. Okay, and it is the midpoint of NP. Okay, why can I write that?
Because it's true.
Because it was given to you.
Also that, yes.
Okay, so I can write that out because it was given. Now, using that statement, I can come up with another statement that I already labeled in my picture. So I had O is the midpoint of NP. So we labeled these two segments equal, right?
We did.
So I can write that in my proof. So I have NO is congruent to OP.
No.
Okay, why can I write that statement?
Because it was, this is a trick question.
I used that O as a midpoint.
Yep.
Okay,
Midpoint
so I'd use midpoint theorem for writing that out. Okay, so whenever you're given something has a midpoint, that's an indication that you're going to use the midpoint theorem to label two segments congruent. Okay, so whenever you're given a midpoint, use midpoint theorem. All right, from here, I need to look at my picture because I still have one more thing that I need in order to prove these triangles congruent.
An angle.
You want an angle, right? What is my freebie in this picture? Which angles could you say are congruent?
Oh.
These middle ones right here, right? Okay, so these two angles are congruent to each other. Why? Because they're vertical angles. So since I labeled this on my picture, you have to write that as a statement. Now when you write out these angles, you cannot say angle O is congruent to angle O. Okay, that's the vertex of 4 different angles. So I would write this as angle MON congruent to angle, or yeah, you can do POQ or QOP. Either way. As long as O is that middle letter. Now again, why can I write that statement? Vertical angle theorem. You can put VA if you want. VA theorem. I'll know what you mean. All right, my last statement then. What does my last statement have to be? You have to write what you're trying to prove. So this should always be your last statement. So triangle MON congruent to triangle QOP. Now, why are these two triangles congruent? Well, look at your labels. I have two sides and one angle between those two sides. Side angle, side. I have an angle between two sides. Questions on this second one? Do you understand how I'm structuring this? A little bit? All right, I want you to look at number 3. They're just going to finish the rest of the packet.
I have answer to number 1. Give it.
All right, so third one here. We are given that WU is parallel to YV. Okay, so WU and YV are parallel, so it has those arrows in it. You're also given that YU is parallel to ZV. Again, it has those arrows in it to show they're parallel. Now, if I have given you parallel lines, what is that an indication you need to look for? What did we look for in the first one when you were given parallel lines? Congruent what? Congruent angles. So whenever you're given parallel lines, you need to look for congruent angles. Okay? And again, that is the property on the very back of that packet from yesterday. Okay? If you're given parallel lines, you look for those congruent angles. Now the last thing I was given is segment WY congruent to YZ. Okay, so we have YZ right here and WY right here. So we mark those as congruent. And we are trying to prove our two triangles here are congruent to each other. Okay? So first statement, I have every single piece of that given information. Okay, so that is given. Now, since all three of those statements from your given are in the same line, you won't have another given written down further. Okay? So since all of that's already in one line, you don't have another one further down. So I need to use this given information to say why I can make those other statements. Well, I'm going to use that my two lines here are parallel. Okay, so WU and YV are parallel. Okay, now I have this transversal that cuts through both of those parallel lines right here. So that transversal, yep. This one? So when you do that one, okay, you would have an angle that's not in your triangle here. And you would have this angle that's partially in your triangle, but then the rest of it's on the outside of that triangle. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah? So I'm using this one because I know it creates an angle within my triangle.
Okay.
So here, looking at my transversal, that transversal hits this angle here and this angle here. Okay, so with my parallel lines in that transversal, do you remember what angle pair that is?
No.
It's not alternate interior this time.
It's
Not consecutive interior, but it does start.
Oh, wait.
They're corresponding angles. Okay, so on the back of your property packet, again, back of the property packet, we're using the statement that says if parallel because you are given parallel lines. So if those lines are parallel, then we can say corresponding angles are congruent. Okay, because they were corresponding and they are congruent.
This is very confusing. How much of this have you actually done?
All right, so I just used this part of the given. Okay, I'm going to use the other set of parallel lines now. So again, when you're given parallel lines, you have to look for congruent angles. Shh. Quiet. You have to look for congruent angles with those parallel lines. So here, my parallel lines. Okay, and it's saying in my statement that angle Z is congruent to angle WYU. Okay, so WYU is right here. And angle Z is right here. Okay, so these two angles are congruent. Since I'm using those parallel lines, what type of angle pair are those two angles? What? They are corresponding. They are corresponding as well. So what should my reason be for saying that these are congruent? Because they're corresponding. So I would say if those lines are parallel, then corresponding angles are congruent. So now looking at the labels in both of my triangles, why are those two triangles congruent? Look at your labels. Look at the labels on the triangles. By angle, side, angle. Okay, angle, side, angle.
So is the rest of the camera here?
It will be. I know. Okay, questions on 3. All right, so go to number 4. All right, shh. Quiet, please. Quiet, please. So again, first thing you want to do is look at your given and label your picture. So here, I have segment AB is congruent to segment AD. Okay, so AB and AD. Label those segments congruent to each other. Same thing with BC and CD. Okay, so I'm trying to prove that triangle ABC, so this one here, is congruent to triangle ADC, so this one over here. Okay, so starting my proof, I always start with my given information, and the reason behind that is because it's given to you. Now, looking at this picture, I can't make another statement just by using this given. So if that happens, you need to look at your picture for a freebie. So in this picture, you don't have vertical angles, but they do share a side, right? Okay, so they share this side AC. So remember when I said when they share a side, it's equal to itself? Okay, so I label it equal to itself, but since I labeled that in the picture, you have to write it in your proof. Okay, so that's where you use this AC is congruent to itself. Okay, so since you label it in the picture, you have to write that it's congruent to itself. Now, which one of your properties says it's equal to itself? That is the reflexive property. Okay, so use that reflexive property if something's equal to itself. So my last statement here has to be what I'm trying to prove. So triangle ABC is congruent to triangle ADC. Okay, and then why would those two triangles be congruent according to the labels in your picture? By side, side, side. Okay, questions on number 4. That one's real short.
Yeah, can we not do homework on this?
You have to practice it.
I don't think.
So much. How should I practice this when I don't even know what I'm doing?
You have to look back and forth between your picture and your given. And then you have to look at your property packet.
Maybe the first step is given, and maybe the last one.
I've done your pictures of it.
If I get to know how to fill it in.
I don't, yeah,
That's why you practice.
there's letters.
Or ask
There are letters.
for
All right, so go to number 6. Go to number 6. Shh, quiet please. Number 6. Skipping number 5, going to number 6. So in number 6, we have PN bisects angle MNO. Okay, so this segment here is bisecting this angle. What do you know about a bisector? What's equal? Not the sides,
The triangles. That's right.
the angles. Okay, it's talking about an angle being split into two congruent parts. Okay, when you're bisecting an angle, you split the angle into two congruent parts, not the sides. Okay, so these two angles would be congruent because of that bisector. Okay, I'm also given that MN is congruent to ON. So I need to label that in my picture as well. MN, ON. Okay, I'm trying to prove that triangle MNP is congruent to triangle ONP. Okay, so my two separate triangles here. So starting my proof, I need to start with my given information. Okay, what I labeled in my picture is that these two angles were congruent. Whenever you label something in your picture, you need to write it as a statement. Okay, so here I would write angle MNP. Okay, MNP, that's this one right here. Cannot say angle N and angle N. Is congruent to angle ONP. Okay, now why did I label those two angles congruent originally? Because of a bisector. Which one of my properties talks about a bisector? The definition of bisect. Okay, so that's why those two angles would be congruent. Okay, my other thing I was given were my sides, and I already labeled that. And it is already in my proof, so I don't need to write it again. However, I do have a freebie in this picture. Okay, what's my freebie in this picture?
Midpoint, and midpoint and P is the same thing. P is a midpoint. I look at that.
NP is equal to itself, right? Okay, they share that side. So I would need to write NP is congruent to NP. Okay, and again, when something is equal to itself, that is the reflexive property. Okay, then looking at your labels, we were trying to prove these triangles congruent. So that should be my last statement. And why are those two triangles congruent? By side angle side. Okay, you have an angle between two sides. Make sense? Kinda? Alright, so there's only 3 more problems. Yes? Only 3 more problems. So number 5 is very similar to number 4.
Thank you.
Okay, 5 is very similar to 4. 7 is kind of like number 3. And then 8 is more like number 3. Okay, so whenever you're given parallel lines, make sure you're looking for those angle pairs.